Alright, so now that we've taken a look at our approach to rendering that we're going to take, and we've gone in and set up the shadow take so that we can enable shadows when we need to render out a shadow pass, let's take a look back at the rendering script that we're going to be creating. If we jump back to the whiteboard, we saw when we were talking about the rendering script that we're going to create a description of a render. So we're going to create something that describes what we want to render out, and we're going to do that in a description file. That's going to be a text-based document that we define how we want that document to look, and we define what kind of things we're going to write into that document. Our script will take that document in, process it, and generate our renders based on that document. And in this video, we're going to take a look at exactly what is going to comprise that render description document, and how did we come about coming up with what we wanted to be in that document.
So let's make sure everyone has a very clear mental picture, and that is that we're writing two things. We're going to end up writing a Python script. That Python script will then use what you create in that render description file.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure everybody's very clear that there's two components here.
And this allows us to write the script one time and then have these render description files that we can keep writing and very quickly set up all the passes we want. We then run the script on those files and it will go ahead and render out all of our passes.
This means that this particular utility is not chained to just this project. You can use it with any of your future projects, and it's a very powerful script. So you'll have some excellent rendering abilities at your fingertips that you can take advantage of quickly if you keep the script around.
Exactly. So we talked in the last whiteboard video that we did about needing objects, lights, and passes described in our description of a render. So let's go ahead and bring up a new layer and start talking a little bit more detail what we're going to have in our description. So we said we needed to have objects, lights, and what pass we're rendering. And we can think of these as being per render settings. Every render that we do, every pass that we render out, is going to have a different selection of objects, lights, and a pass type. So these are per render settings. We could also be really useful to have some global settings in there, things like which camera are we rendering from, what start frame, and what end frame. Because if we think about it, we could set this up in such a way that we have one description file for each shot we want to render, and we go in and one time say that we're rendering from a particular camera for that shot, and that shot has a certain start and end frame, and that means that we may have, 30 or 40 different passes for a shot in some cases. We don't want to have to go in and specify a camera and a start and end frame 30 or 40 times. It makes much more sense to do it for one shot and then specify all of our per render settings for each of the passes belonging to that shot, and then we only have to specify these global settings the once. So these are global settings. And you can see that we've got almost like having a series of items that we need to assign things to. Objects can be thought of as an item, and then we have to specify, well, which objects do we want to render? Lights can be thought of as an item, and we then have to say, well, which lights do we want to render with? Pass can be thought of as an item, and we have to specify, well, which pass do we want to render? Do we want to do a suffuse? Do we want to do specular? Do we want to do shadow? The same thing with our global settings. Camera can be thought of as an item, whereby we then say which camera do we want to render through. And the same with start and end frame. So all of these can be thought of as having something whereby we have an item, and we assign into that item something. So what if we write something that looks like this into our description file, whereby we have a command. Into that command we assign an argument. And what do I mean by this? Well, we have full control over what we type into our render description file. We have full control over coming up with our own ideas for what we'd like to be commands, and our full control over exactly what we would type into the arguments. So let's just scroll down slightly. So we could come up with something, and when we're dealing with our camera, for example, we could come up with something that had a command like camera space equals space, and then we could assign, well, what do we want to assign to our camera? If we're dealing with a camera, we're dealing with an object node in Houdini, and if we're dealing with a node, it makes a lot of sense to specify that node with a path. So I am making the decision right now to say that if we're specifying a camera, the argument to that camera should be a path to a camera node. So let's take shot 2, for example, or shot 1. So we could have /obj, and then any of our cameras. I'm going to say something like shot 01. So we've decided that in our description file, to specify what camera we're going to use the command camera, and that's a command that we've just invented, we've come up with that, and we want the argument to be a path to the camera. Again, we've decided this because we know if we need to specify a camera in a scene, most likely we're going to need the full path to that camera. And we can continue doing this for other things. Start and end frame. What if we were to say, come up with a command that we call start, and assign that to equal, I don't know, frame 1?
Sounds good. Though make sure that it's very clear to everyone that those underscores that you are creating, they are just to represent spaces only. Basically, these guys right here.
Yeah, and
spaces only. That's not an actual underscore that would be.
And that's, yeah, it's just to make it very clear that there's a single space there, because when we come to breaking this down, when our script reads in this file and has to break it down, we have to be very careful that we have one space, an equal sign, and then another space, because of the way that I've decided to break this down to keep things as simple as possible. So whenever I'm writing equals, I'm making sure I'm clearly showing spaces using an underscore. When you actually type this into a document, you just have a space. So we've got our start frame, and we could set that equal to 1. We could come up with a command that we call end. We could set that equal to 220. Going with our first shot, I think 1 to 220 was what we decided on for our first shot. So that deals with our global settings, but we can take the exact same approach on a per render setting. So we've got our objects, our lights, and our paths. What if we come up with commands to say, okay, I want my objects to equal, and we can specify more than one object. What if we were to say, okay, I want to specify the pool, the ladder, and the stage, because in this pass I'm rendering out the set. Now, how are we going to go about specifying objects? Because we could just go in here and we could use full paths, like with our camera, to specify objects. But I'm going to take a step away from our description file and think back to how we're going to set this up when we come to implement it. And I know that when we come to implement it, we're going to make use of, as I jump over into Houdini and switch over to the output context and create a mantra render node, we're going to make use of the candidate objects and candidate lights parameter on the render node. And you'll notice if you specify an object in the candidate objects, so let's grab our pool and accept, we don't use a path, we simply use the object name. So we remove the /obj/. We could specify another object. Let's grab our ladder as well. You'll notice that we have a space in between, and then the ladder again without /obj/. Because I know that the objects that we're specifying I'm going to assign into this parameter, I'm going to go with the same convention that Houdini's used for specifying this parameter. So I'm going to specify my objects without /obj/ and space separating them. So I'm going to set that, well, let's just delete out that render node. It's probably the easiest thing. So I'm going to say, okay, objects are going to be specified without /obj/, and they're going to be space separated. For example, we could say, I want the pool, underscore is actually a space, ladder. Let's say we are rendering the set, and we said the set consists of the pool, ladder, and stage. So we could have space, stage, and we can keep specifying as many objects as we want, space separating. And the way this is going to work, because we said we need a space equals and a space for this assignment, this means that everything after that is going to be our argument. So the pool, ladder, and stage are all our argument that's going to get assigned into our objects command. The same approach can be taken with lights. We could say, come up with a command that we call lights, and we could say that that is set equal to, well, let's say we're rendering with our main spotlight. So let's say we want main spot 1, space, main spot 2. And you'll notice I'm taking the same approaches with our objects. I'm not specifying /obj/, because the candidate lights parameter on the render node works in the exact same way as candidate objects. It simply takes in space separated object names, lights are object nodes, without the /obj/. Now finally, looking at the series of things we need at the top, we also need to deal with passes. And passes are interesting because we don't have a single parameter we need to change in Houdini to set us into a particular pass. We've got a series of things that we need to do, and we discussed those a couple of videos ago. But what if we come up with a system whereby we're going to say that this script deals with specular, diffuse, and shadow. And we've already talked about the fact that depth is so far removed from these three passes, we're going to do it separately from the script. Specular, diffuse, and shadow are going to be the passes we deal with in the script. Well, what if we were to have an option, a command that we create where we can specify one of these three things, and based on it being set to one of these three things, later on in the script will then react accordingly. So we could have a command that we call pass, and we could assign that one of three things, either diffuse, specular, or our shadow pass, and we'd need to make sure that when we type these, we use the exact phrase or word, diffuse, spelled all lowercase in that particular manner, specular or shadow, because we're going to look out for our pass command being set to one of these three things, exactly written as one of these three. So this is taking a look at our objects, lights, pass, camera, start and end frame, but what we've already seen is that we're changing parameters on a render node, and it's going to be bad to just assume that we're going to be changing parameters on, say, /obj /mantra1, which is the default name when we create a mantra render node. It would be much better to have a command where we can specify which render node we actually want to render with. So we can use a command that we call render node, space equals space, and then specify a path to a render node. And the reason I want a full path is because I want to be able to access this node so I can go onto this node and change parameters. So we could specify /obj /mantra1, for example, and that would allow us to use this mantra1 render node as the render node that we make all of our changes on throughout the rest of the script. Now, since some of these commands, things like camera, start, and end, would change parameters on our render node, it makes a lot of sense to say we're going to have some more rules other than just simple commands and assignments. We're going to have rules whereby we have ordering taking place in our file. I'm going to say that we have to specify a render node before we specify any other command that will change parameters on a render node or set up parameters per render. So this means that render node is most likely going to be the first line in any render description file we have. And when we come to write the script, you're going to see the script is written such that if we don't specify a render node and we call any of these other commands, the script is going to error out because we're expecting render node to be called before we call anything else. So just keep that in mind. Now, we've got most of our commands in place, but you can already possibly see an issue with how are we going to tell the script that we're wanting more than one render, because right now we're setting up some global settings and then we're setting up the per render settings on a single render, but we have no way of telling it, okay, this is for one render, now move on to the next render. So let's come up with another command, and this command's going to be a special command because it's not going to take any arguments. It's simply going to be the new render command, and this is a command that I've devised, I've come up with just to basically tell my script that I want to start a new render. And the way this is going to work, we use new render, we have to call new render before we call any of these, because that makes sense. We're saying, okay, start a new render, specify the object, specify the light, specify the path for that render. Once we specified these, we can then call new render again, and specify these again. We can specify objects, lights and paths for that render, then call new render again, and repeat. So as long as we call new render once at the start, we can then specify the objects, lights and paths for that render and keep repeating. You'll also see when we come to write the script that we can specify objects, lights and paths in any order that we like after new render, and that we can actually specify them more than once, and whichever one is specified last before we call new render again will be the one that's actually used for the render. So the new render command is going to allow us to put multiple render passes into a single description file. So in the same way that we were calling render node before we specify cameras and start and end, we're going to call new render before we specify objects, light and pass, and we're pretty much there. The final thing we need to deal with is file names, because right now we're not specifying which file name to render out with, and it would be really bad to go to all this work to get an automated system to render out all these passes only to save them all into a single file. That would be extremely humiliating if you came back from a night of rendering and found that you only had one file and it didn't have all your passes. It would also be kind of frustrating to have to build up these file names yourself and have to, just put a file name command where we specify the entire thing. It would make a lot more sense to keep everything organized based on a variety of different parameters, things like, well, which objects are we rendering? It would be really useful to have which objects we're rendering have some play in the name, and which lights we're rendering from and which pass type we're rendering from, all to take part in the name. So I've devised a naming convention that I really like to use. Let's bring up a new layer. And this naming convention is going to look something a little bit like this. We're going to have, I am not drawing.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yep, it's decided to stop.
And 1 second. Aha, that would be why.
Oh, left click is really not cool. Right, let's get rid of that. There we go. Much better. Sweet. So as I was saying, we're dealing with a naming convention, and that naming convention is going to look something a little bit like this. Let's take a base name, and this is like a directory that we're going to have as our base directory, and all our renders are going to exist within that directory. From there, let's jump into a new folder whereby we specify the shot number we're working on. So that way we could have a renders folder somewhere on our hard drive. We jump inside that, and in this project we're going to see shot 1, shot 2, shot 3, and shot 4 as 4 separate folders, so that we can quickly get access to the files, to the frames that are dealing with the shot that we're interested in. From there, it would be great to jump inside that folder and see folders for all our objects. So we jump inside shot 1 and we'd see the stadium and we'd see the audience inside that folder. If we jumped inside shot 2, we'd see the set and we'd see the character, because that logically makes sense. We're breaking things down from having all of our files in one folder to break it up based on shots, now break it up based on objects. Once we've broken it up based on objects, I'm happy to have all our files within a single folder for an object, but I want more information in the file name that tells us which lights and which passes. I'm also going to reuse the object name just in case files did get misplaced on the hard drive. You'd still have information about which object this belongs to. So I'm going to use a file name of object underscore, and in this case this is actually an underscore and not a space, object underscore light underscore pass dot $F3, so we're going to have our frame number in the file name, and then our file type, and let's just assume that we're going to be using the .pic file type. So what might this look like if we were actually doing a render for our project? Well, it might look something like this. We might have C/projects /td underscore volume underscore 2 / renders. We may choose this to be our base. So this is our folder. Inside this renders folder up under our projects is where all of our files are going to go. Then we could have /, and let's say that we're rendering out shot 2. So let's say we're rendering shot 2. We'd then see a shot 2 folder that is our shot number. Then we'd say, well, what if we're rendering our character? So we'd have a character folder up underneath that. And this would be our object that we're rendering. And then we'd have the actual file sequence itself. Let's say we were rendering the character fill light with a diffuse pass. So we'd have object, that's going to be character again. Underscore, what light are we rendering from? The character fill. So character, that is an F. Character fill. And what pass are we doing? Let's say diffuse. $F3. .pic. So we've got our object, our light, and our pass. So this is the naming convention I'm going to go with because it provides a huge amount of information to do with which object, which light, which pass, and which shot our file is representing, and that's incredibly important. You want to make sure that all of these files we're rendering out are very organized, because let's take a look at our animation. We have 650 frames. We're actually going to have more than 650 because we're overlapping some frames from shots. We've got 5 or 6 different objects and a huge amount of lights that we're rendering for, not to mention the fact that we're going to have 3 different pass types. So you can see we're going to have an incredible number of frames that are rendered out. If we don't keep them organized, things are going to become a nightmare to then manage. We keep things organized nicely based on a naming convention and a folder structure, and this is the one that I've decided to go with for this project. It means that it's going to be very quick for us to jump in, find the files, very quick to see which passes we still need to render, very quick when we're compositing to find the files that we need to bring in. So this is the naming convention I'm going to go with, and we can see that things like the base and the shot number would be very easy to assign using our command-based system we've already devised in our script. So let's come up with 2 new commands. Let's come up with a file base command, space equals space, and then we could specify whatever we wanted to be this base part of our directory structure. In this example, our file base would be set to C /projects /td vol2 /renders. We could also have a command where we can specify our shot name, so that we can specify this shot number part of our folder structure. So in this case, we can specify shot name space equals space, and let's say that we're rendering shot 02, as in this example. The reason I'm keeping these separate, if we're working on a project, the chances are the file base is going to be the same for all of our shots, so it would be nice to be able to copy some of our lines from some description files over into others, and then simply modify the shot name separately. It also allows us to, if we decided to restructure and have the base, but then not use the shot name within the folder structure, but maybe put that inside the file name, we now have things separate and we wouldn't have to rewrite our description files, we'd only need to go in and rewrite our script. So we've got file base and shot name. Now, lights and objects are going to pose an interesting problem, because if we jump back over and take a look at when we're specifying lights and objects, we have multiple objects and multiple lights that are space separated, and it wouldn't make sense to have spaces in our name and also to have multiple objects in our name. So what if we were able to take these objects and assign to these objects an ID, more like a nickname? So we could take all of the pool, ladder and stage and really refer to it as the set, because that's what it is. Logically and in English terms, the pool, ladder and stage we're thinking of as the set. And what if we were to take our main spot 1 and our main spot 2 and give it a nickname, something like main spots? So if we had a way of saying, instead of taking this as our object name, and instead of taking this as our lights name, instead we're going to use this nickname for our objects and this nickname for our lights, we could then jump over and inside of our file naming convention...
writing on, yeah.
Ah, sweet. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Inside of our file naming convention, for object, we could now take that nickname. For object here, we take the same nickname, and for light, we take our light's nickname. And this is really quite easy. What we can do is devise two new commands that will exist inside of, let's jump over back to here. They're going to exist inside of our new render block. So we're going to have new render, we'll specify objects, lights, and pass, and we'll also have two new commands that we specify for that render. And that's going to be the oname and the lname commands. The oname, which we'd have space equals space, we could set to something like set in our example where we had our pool, ladder, and our stage. So now we're referring to the objects specifically for rendering, we're referring to the actual object names, but when we're coming to setting up our naming convention, we're now referring to their nickname. And we can do the same with lights, so we can say space equals space, and let's call our lights main spots. So by introducing two new commands, we've got an easy way of giving the objects and the lights human readable names, as well as specifying exactly which objects and lights are going to be rendered with. So that's all of the commands we're going to use in our render description file, and that's an overview of how we're going to approach the render description file. Before we conclude, I'd like to just maybe run through a couple of examples so you can see if we were writing a render description file, how would we go about doing that using all of these commands we've come up with. So I will start that on a new layer. And let's just do an example whereby we're rendering a couple of passes from shot 1. So we'd start out and we'd specify our render node. So we'd say render node, and I'm going to assume that I've created a render node in Houdini and left it with the default name. So we're going to have render node space equals space, and we're going to specify our mantra1 render node. So now that we specified a render node, we have the ability to go in and change some of the parameters, so we can specify what camera are we rendering from and our start and end frame for this shot. So let's say that the camera for shot 1, we know that space equals space. We know that that camera is /obj/shot01, because that's how we named our camera for shot 1. And we know the start and end frames for our first shot are frames 1 through 220. So let's say start space equals space 1 and end space equals space 220. We can also set up our file base and our shot name for this particular shot. So the file base is going to be c:/projects/td vol2 /renders, because that's where I'd like all of our renders for this project to be rendered into. And we can also say that our shot name, in this case, is going to be equal to shot01, so that these renders are going to go inside this renders folder and then inside a shot01 folder. So any renders that we specify below that are going to be saved into these directories. So now that we've got our global settings for this shot out of the way, we can jump down and we can say, okay, I'm ready to set up a new render. So we call the new render command. And now that we've called the new render command, we have the ability to specify our objects, the object name that we'd like to use as the nickname for those objects. We can specify lights, the light name we're going to use as a nickname for those lights, and then finally, which pass do we want to render with. So I'll just do a couple of examples. Let's say that we want to render our stadium, and we want to render our stadium using the top-down bleachers light. And with that bleachers light, we want to render a diffuse pass. So our objects would be equal to, and if you recall, if we jump back over to Houdini, our stadium is actually named stadium import. Let's find our stadium. So our stadium was actually named stadium import. That's the name of the object at object level. So this is the name we'd need to specify to make sure when we render we specify this exact object node. So our object is going to be stadium import. However, we don't really want to have stadium import as our name when we're saving out our files, so we'll specify that our nickname that we're using for this object is going to be simply stadium. Now, in terms of lights, we said we wanted to render the bleachers top light, so lights space equals space bleachers top. And I'm happy with bleachers top to also be our nickname for the light. So let's say that L name is equal to bleachers top. Finally, what pass type are we rendering? We're going to render a diffuse. So let's say that pass is equal to diffuse. So now we've specified our render settings for one render. We can go ahead and we can say, okay, I'm ready to specify my next render. So we'll call the new render command. And let's this time take our bleachers bounce light for the stadium as another example. So we can see that objects, well, that's going to be the same. We're dealing with our stadium again. So let's say that our objects is equal to stadium import. And that our O name is equal to stadium. And in this case, we're dealing with the bleachers bounce light. So we'd say, okay, light is equal to bleachers bounce. L name is equal to, and I'm happy to give that a nickname of the same, so bleachers bounce. And finally, we'll do another diffuse pass, since that light only actually emits diffuse. So you can see quickly we can come in and into a text document we can say new render, which objects, what nickname, which lights, what nickname, which pass, new render over and over again, and very quickly describe all of the different passes we need. And now we can go ahead and write a script that will come in and it will read line by line through this file, and it will interpret all of these commands that we've come up with and the arguments that we've come up with to give to these commands. It will interpret those, it will work with that data, and it will set up all of our renders based on this description that we've created. And with that, that is an overview of our description file, and we can now move on to creating the script. So thanks a lot.